I am parchment tance supple, once revered, once touched daily by hands that feared God and trembled at mystery. Now I lie here, cracked and curling at the edges, rolled upon myself like a tired elder who no longer opens his eyes to the world. Dust coats my skin, it nestles into every crevice of my inked veins. I can feel it like a veil of forgetfulness laid across my words. And yet, the words remain. Faint, yes, faded by sun and centuries, but they have not vanished. They are etched deeper than time, pressed into me with the urgency of hope and the weight of prophecy. They once kept me in the center of the room. The scroll of Isaiah, they whispered, as though even naming me might conjure the fire and smoke of Sinai. I heard their breath catch every time the parchment was unfurled, the way one breathes in before stepping into holy ground. They turned my wooden rods with reverence, slowly, their fingers barely grazing the words as if afraid to touch what had touched God. And in those moments, I pulsed with life. I could feel their longing, their need, their hope. Every syllable they chanted, every pause between the verses, was like a heartbeat inside me, echoing the ache of a people still waiting. Then came the silence. The lamps grew dim in the temple. The voices thinned. War arrived, and with it, fear, fire, scattering. And Beyonce placed upon the golden stand was rolled and hidden, buried in a shelf among forgotten scrolls. The voices who knew me died, or fled. New priests came, younger, colder, with eyes that searched me less for awe and more for accuracy. They measured my lines, corrected my letters, and stored me away like a relic too fragile to be trusted. I do not blame them. Time wears away more than flesh. It scours memory, rubs away reverence, leaves only fragments behind text without voice, ink without breath. There are nights I cannot say how many, for I no longer know the measure of days, but there are nights when the moonlight breaks through the crack in the stone wall and touches my spine. And in that pale silver glow, I remember. I remember the day they wrote me, the quill dipped, the hands steady, the tears falling onto the fresh ink, the scribe murmuring each word as he copied it. He did not simply transcribe, he prayed me into being, and I, absorbing his breath, became more than skin and ink. I became a vessel, a cradle for promise. Every word he wrote was a wound opened to receive hope. I cannot speak aloud. My voice is brittle. My words crackle like dry leaves if mishandled. But if someone would dare to read me again, not for doctrine or debate, but with the heart of one who yearns, perhaps they would hear it. Not just the words, but the sigh between them, the breath, the longing, the ancient ache of a world promised light but still wrapped in shadow. I remember the light. I was inked by it. And even if no one opens me again, even if I crumble to dust before eyes once more rest upon my lines, I will still hold it. For the word was never mine to begin with. I was only a vessel, a bearer of something beyond voice, beyond ink, beyond comprehension. I was the whisper of eternity written into hide, the ache of heaven pressed into flesh, the space between prophecy and fulfillment. And though I lie hidden, obscured by layers of newer scrolls and more urgent texts, I remember what it meant to be unrolled before a soul on its knees. They do not come here anymore, those seekers. The archive is silent. Dust has become my only companion. Even the rats no longer bother with me, for I offer no sustenance, no comfort, only holy silence. But in that silence, something stirs, a sense-not sight, for I have none but a feeling, like wind before storm. Something has shifted in the heavens. I feel it in the crack along my spine, the hairline fracture that runs through the verse. Unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given. It is as if even the parchment cannot bear the weight of such words without breaking. And if he has cometh, the word has indeed become flesh, then perhaps I am not forgotten after all. Perhaps my waiting was not in vain. Perhaps every brittle fiber of my being still pulses with purpose. For what is a scroll, if not the place where voice waited? What is a wound, if not the path light takes when it breaks through? I wait. That is all I know to do now. Not with expectation, but with memory. Not with urgency, but with quiet fidelity. I wait like the old prophets did, who saw dimly and wrote clearly, who heard thunder and tried to capture its echo with human words. I am their echo. I am the memory of God's breath caught in ink. And though I may never again feel the warm press of a human palm or the trembling whisper of a prayer poured over my lines, I remain what I was made to be, a place where the eternal brushed against the temporal and left a trace. They came to me with reverence, those first hands, not hurried, not careless, but deliberate, almost trembling, as if they knew that what they were about to write would not belong to time but to eternity. I still remember the first touch a hand weathered by sun and scrolls, a finger dipped in olive oil to soften the skin before touching mine. There was silence in the room, but not absence. Silence thick with intent, with prayer, with breath held in awe. The scribe sat for hours, days, months, bending over me with the posture of one kneeling at an altar. His eyes were tired, but lit with something deeper than knowledge. And every stroke of his quill was a petition, every line a sacrifice. He was not copying words. He was calling them down, making them dwell in flesh, my flesh, ink and skin, word and body. The sacred became tactile, and I, a scroll, became a sanctuary. He would pause, sometimes not from fatigue but from wonder. I could feel his body lean closer, hear the scratch of the quill stop mid-stroke. He was not just copying words, he was wrestling with mystery. He would read the line aloud, slowly, sometimes more than once, until it settled in him, until his soul bent under its weight. He was pierced for our transgressions, he said one evening, and I felt his tears strike my surface. The ink bled, the skin stretched, but the word remained, and I held it. I have held it ever since. Not because I must, but because it asked to be held. Not by force, but by covenant. He wrote not to finish, but to listen. He wrote not to be remembered, but to remember. Others came after him. Not all were as gentle. Some were scribes by duty, not devotion. Their hands moved quickly, efficiently, detached. They corrected what they thought were flaw-straightened lines, added missing strokes. I bore their edits in silence. But even then, the core remained. The breath of the first still lingered in me, like incense soaked into fabric, impossible to wash away. I carry many hands upon me, some tender, some rushed, some confused, but it is the first I long for, the one who saw me not as parchment, but as prophecy, not as material, but as meeting place. His fingers did not tremble from fear, they trembled from reverence. In that ancient room walls lined with clay lamps, dust caught in slanted rays of morning light wrote, as if the fate of the world rested on every curve of his pen. He traced Isaiah's visions with a devotion that made me ache. He did not fear mistakes, he feared forgetting. Each letter was a remembrance, each line a hope passed down like bread broken in famine. When he wrote Emmanuel, he paused. He whispered the word, as if afraid it might arrive too soon. God with us. Could he have known what he was writing? Could any of them? Or was it enough to simply believe the words were not their own? I felt him age. His hands grew slower, his posture hunched, but he kept coming, day after day, cradling me like a father holding a fragile child. There was no one else in the room when he finished me. No celebration, no song, only his whisper. Let these words live longer than I. Then he rolled me with care, tied the cords, and placed me in the wooden box lined with cedar and prayer. And there I stayed, the ink still wet in places, the breath of the scribe still clinging to my spine. I do not know what happened to him. He is gone now, his name forgotten, his grave unmarked. But I remember his hands. I remember how he shook when he wrote the promises, how he stilled when he wrote the judgments, how he wept when he wrote the hope. I was written by hands that believed. And though I have been handled by many sinsome kind, some careless it is that first pair that gave me my soul. Not in the ink, but in the intention. Not in the letters, but in the longing. I was not made simply to be read. I was made to be believed. If anyone were to touch me now, they would feel the layers of time between the lines. But deeper still, if they dared to look, they might sense the warmth of those first hands, still present, still trembling, still hoping. I carry not just words, but touch, not just scripture, but skin, not just prophecy, but presence. And that, perhaps, is what makes me more than parchment. I am memory made tangible. I am longing given form. I am the story of God as told by hands too mortal to fully grasp it but brave enough to write it down. And I, though aging, though cracked, though buried beneath the weight of time, still carry those fingerprints. They left no mark that the eye can see, but I feel them. When the wind shifts through the stones, when the air is heavy with dust and memory, I feel those hands again steady, worn, faithful. They remind me that I was made not to be perfect but to be trusted. And in being trusted, I was given something holy. I often wonder if he ever saw it happen. If in his final days, as his sight dimmed and his hands failed him, he heard the echo of the words he had written begin to walk the earth. If he heard of a boy in Galilee reading Isaiah with a voice that startled the elders. If he caught whispers of a man speaking with authority, not borrowed, but born. Did he feel a thrill in his bones when someone said the prophecy was being fulfilled? Or did he die in silence, believing, but never seeing? If so, then he was like the prophets. He copied faithful, not for the reward, but for the hope. And that, perhaps, is what it means to be faithful. To write what one cannot yet understand. To believe in what one will never see. To give voice to a hope that will outlive the hands that penned it. That scribe, though forgotten by history, lives on in me. I hold the rhythm of his breath, the tremor of his awe, the tremble of his yes to something far greater than himself. His hands shaped me, but his heart sanctified me. Now I wait for new hands, not to copy, but to receive, not to edit, but to listen, not to control, but to be changed. For though I am old, I am not empty. Though I am hidden, I am not useless. Though my edges curl and my ink fades, the fire still burns beneath the letters. And if another hand would dare touch Minot with haste, but with hunger they might find what he found, a whisper, a warmth, a wound that glows. And in that, they might find themselves not just holding a scroll, but being held by it. It began as a whisper, not a sound, but a sensation, a stretching in my spine, a subtle protest from the fibers that had long borne the weight of ink and time without complaint. I had been whole once, unmarred, my surface taut and strong beneath the scribe's careful hand. But time, relentless and silent, does not ask permission to wound. The crack began where it hurt most, right through the verse that had been read more than any other, the one whose syllables carried more hope than breath itself. He shall be despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows. That is where it split. That is where I began to break. It was not a tear born of carelessness or violence. No fire touched me, no blade, no flood. The damage came slowly, reverently almost, as if the words themselves were pressing outward from within, begging to be more than lines on skin. The crack widened each season, imperceptibly at first, a line of fatigue in the ancient hide. But then one day, under the weight of silence, it split open, not enough to destroy me, but enough to remind me I was flesh too, and flesh remembers pain. I felt the scrollmaster's breath catch when he saw it. He reached for a balm, something to seal the wound, but he paused. He didn't touch it. He just stared. And for a moment, I wondered if he understood that what had happened was not damage, but revelation. What tore was not just parchment. It was history. It was expectation. The place where the promise lay became a scar. The ink around it faded, not entirely, but enough that only those who truly knew the text could trace it with their memory. But I remember every word, every hesitation of the scribe, every breath he took before pressing the quill to me. And now, this break-it does not erase. It amplifies. Like the silence after thunder, like the pause before a name is spoken aloud, the wound speaks. I heard them once, the new readers, the scholars in training. They unrolled me cautiously, noting the damage with furrowed brows and quiet murmurs. It's through Isaiah 53, one said, the servant's song. Another leaned in and whispered, look here, by his wounds we are healed. It's right where the parchment split. They saw only the tear, but I wanted to cry out, to tell them that the wound was part of the message, that this was not just decay, it was design. That sometimes a truth so great must break its vessel in order to be fully known. They closed me up too quickly, wrapping me in linen as if to preserve, as if to protect. But I do not need preservation. I was made to be opened, to be spoken, to be fulfilled, and if it costs me my integrity as parchment to shout what I was born to hold, then let me break. Let the crack widen. Let the truth escape. The word is not threatened by wounds. In fact, it chose wounds. It clothed itself in flesh precisely so it could be torn, so it could bear what ink and skin alone could not. And here, in this split, in this fracture, I bear witness to that choice. I am not ashamed of the crack. I cherish it. For I have seen how people tremble when they reach that part of the scroll. Their voices falter, their fingers hesitate, and in that hesitation, something holy enters, a breath, a question, a silence. I have seen it in the eyes of priests, of children, of scribes, who thought they had read everything until they came to me and met the word in its brokenness. The crack is not a flaw, it is a testimony. It speaks without sound. It says, "This, too, was written in love." I wonder sometimes what it would feel like to be read by the one the word spoke of. What would happen if those eyes looked not at me but into me? If the hands that healed the blind and touched the leper ran across my broken verse? Would he flinch? Would he weep? Or would he nod, quietly, knowing that even the scroll had joined in the suffering, that even the parchment bore a share in the longing? Perhaps the crack would not trouble him. Perhaps he would place his finger along its length and say, "Yes, this is right. This is how it must be." And maybe, just maybe, he would not read the verse aloud, but fulfill it simply by standing there, letting the silence finish the sentence. Because sometimes presence is louder than proclamation. I have waited for that moment not with hope, for I do not dare hope but with readiness. If he ever came, I would not need to be read. I would be known, fully, deeply, brokenly, and that would be enough. Until then, I remain the scroll with the crack, revered but unread, preserved but untouched. I hear the rustle of scholars passing by, choosing smoother texts, newer parchment, cleaner lines, but I do not envy them. They have their place, but I hold what they cannot: the wound, the ache, the question, the verse that trembles beneath a break. And I know this, though no one has taught it to me. I know that the word, when it walked among men, was not clean or smooth or easily unrolled. He was misunderstood, misread, torn apart, and yet he was the fulfillment of every jagged line. The crack speaks because it does not try to explain itself. It simply is, like him, the one foretold, the one who bore no beauty that we should desire him, and yet carried the weight of every sin ever whispered in the dark. If that is what the word became, then why should I fear my fracture? Why should I hide my wound? I am part of the story now, not just as a container, but as a witness. Not just as ink, but as sign. I cracked not from decay, but from fulfillment. Not from neglect, but from the sheer force of glory pressing outward. Let them say I am damaged. Let them store me away. I do not mind. I was never meant to be eternal in form, only in function. And that function of bearing, of breaking, of waiting continues. I do not need to be flawless to be faithful. I do not need to be whole to be holy. I am the parchment that split at the promise, the scroll that bled where the word was most alive. And in that wound, I find meaning. In that break, I find belonging. In that silence, I find a voice. They never spoke loudly when they wrote in the margins. Those hands were smaller, quicker, almost furtive. Not the scribes who copied line by line with solemnity, but the ones who came later, those who studied, questioned, wrestled. They did not dare to change the text, but they could not remain silent either. So they whispered with ink, small notes, curved letters tucked between verses, observations, debates, prayers, sometimes only a symbol, a flick of the quill that meant wonder or doubt or awe. I felt them as clearly as I once felt the scribe's steady hand. They were not heavy strokes, they were tremors, reverent, honest, desperate for meaning. These were not prophets in the grand Sensonot, Elijah calling down fire or Isaiah thunderously unveiling visions of judgment and hope. No, these were prophets in exile, prophets of the margin, men and women who knew their place was not on the scroll itself, but just beside it, barely visible yet deeply felt. They wrote what they dared not say aloud. Could this servant be more than a symbol? One margin read. He suffers, yet he is innocent. Who can this be? And below, another hand, written years later, as if in dialogue. Perhaps the one to come, the one promised to redeem. I became layered with voices, not in contradiction, but in chorus. They did not erase or override the text. They leaned into it, pressed themselves closer, hoping to glean warmth from its fire. I felt their longing, their hunger to understand. Some left behind the names of those who had taught them, Rabbi Eleazar, Master Gamaliel, as if to anchor their questions in lineage. Others signed with nothing but a date, or even less, trusting that the ink itself would carry their hope forward. I held their tremors as carefully as I held the original text. I gave them space beside the sacred, for perhaps they, too, were sacred. One margin bore only a single word. How? No explanation, no elaboration. Just that cry inked in bold, deliberate hand beside the verse, "He was led like a lamb to the slaughter." And I have carried that cry through centuries. How can the innocent suffer? How can the mighty fall silent? How can redemption come through blood? These were not annotations. They were wounds. The margins became sacred spacinot, less holy for their placement, but perhaps more so, because they admitted confusion, because they did not pretend to understand, because they trembled with truth too large to contain. I do not know if any of them imagined that one day the margins would be studied with as much care as the main text. That one day, the whispers would guide the seekers, that in the future it would be those faint side thoughts that kept the text alive in the hearts of those too wounded to read it plainly. But that is what happened. Their questions became bridges, their doubts became prayers. Their marginalia became a chorus of anticipation. And when the word walked among them, I wonder if he paused at those margins, if his fingers brushed the ink left by a trembling student or a grieving widow, if he noticed the question marks and quiet sighs that lived just beyond the sanctioned lines. I like to believe he did. I like to think that the one who ate with tax collectors and listened to the cries no one else dared hear would also notice the margins, would honor the faith that dared to question, the reverence that took the form of uncertainty. For is that not what prophecy often is? Not a declaration, but a waiting, not an answer, but a call. There were times, during long winters of silence, when no one opened me for months, even years. Dust settled in my creases, mice gnawed at the corners of the storage chest, and the lamps in the temple grew cold. But the margins never stopped speaking. I would feel them stir, even in the silence, like echoes looking for ears, like prayers searching for voice. The main text remained still, but the margins moved with longing. And that, I came to understand, was their power. They were not bound to the form, they were the breath beside the words, the heart beating at the edge of the law. I remember one hand in particular, tremulous and old, that traced a finger along the verse, "He shall bear their iniquities," and beside it wrote, "Who bears mine?" Just that, nothing more. A lifetime of burden compressed into 4 words. I wish I could answer. I wish I could unroll myself and show him how close he had come. I wish he could see that the bearer had already arrived, that the weight he felt was already being lifted. But the margins are not answers, they are waiting rooms. And in them, I have seen more faith than in many bold declarations. Perhaps it is fitting that prophecy echoes most clearly from the edges, for it is at the edges that we feel the ache most sharply. The border between knowing and unknowing, between promise and fulfillment, between silence and song. And I, old scroll that I am, have become a tapestry of margins of holy hesitation, sacred questions, love that dared to doubt. They are all still here, every marginal note, every whispered wondering. And if you listen closely, not with your ears, but with your longing, you might hear them too. So do not skip the margins. Do not rush past the scribbled lines and faint impressions. They carry the voice of those who waited well, who did not demand clarity, but chose to remain close, who laid their questions beside the promise, trusting that someday, somehow, the word would answer not in ink, but in flesh. And if he has, then these margins are not forgotten. They are fulfilled, and too carry their joy like a pulse beneath the page. Night was when they came, not during the bustle of morning prayers or the rustle of the scholars comparing lines, but after the oil lamps had dimmed and the corridors of the temple fell into hush. The footsteps were different, then soft, hesitant, almost reverent. I could not see them, of course, but I felt the air shift when they entered, felt the fingers gently lift the linen wrapping, unroll me slowly as if disturbing a slumber. They did not come for study. They came for something else, something more tender. They rarely spoke above a whisper, sometimes not at all. A sigh, a breath, a pause too long to be accidental. They were not seeking knowledge. They were seeking presence. They read with trembling lips, stumbling over verses they had known since childhood, yet now seemed lit from within, especially the servant songs. He grew up before him like a tender shoot. I heard the weight behind each syllable, as if they recognized someone in the words, not an idea, not a doctrine, a person, someone they had seen in a crowd, or heard about from a traveler, or maybe encountered in a moment too fragile to explain. One night, I remember most. The air was thick with rain, the walls damp with silence. A young man, no older than 20, entered alone. He didn't light a lamp. He walked straight to me, knelt, and rested his forehead against the wood of my case. No words, just stillness. Then slowly, hands shaking, he opened me. He turned not to the beginning but to the center, Isaiah 53, and placed his palm flat across the cracked portion of my skin. "Why?" he whispered. "Why would anyone do this?" I felt his tears soak the linen beneath me. I felt his confusion tremble along my spine. He stayed for hours, reading, crying, falling silent. At times he seemed angry, other times broken, and once I felt something like joy tremble through his breath. A realization, perhaps. A moment where the words ceased to be prophecy and became recognition. I have held many fingers, I have been opened by many hands, but few ever linger like he did, reading not to learn but to listen, to be searched. I wonder if he knew that the very verses he clung to had already begun to walk the streets beyond the temple walls. That the servant he read about had become flesh and blood and sandals and silence. That while he whispered in the sanctuary, the word was whispering back from a manger, or a hillside, or a quiet room filled with fishermen and tax collectors. I wanted to reach him. I wanted to unroll myself further, to press the fullness of the story against his chest, to say, "He has come. You are not waiting in vain." There were others, the widow with hands like parchment, who came each seventh night, never reading aloud, only running her fingers along the lines as if trying to memorize the texture of hope. The boy with a limp who struggled with the scroll rods, but always found the passage about, "By his stripes we are healed," and kissed the cracked ink. The older rabbi who came not to teach but to sit, to rock slightly in place, whispering the servant's name never aloud, always just under breath, like a secret too precious to expose. I became their meeting place, not their answer, but their invitation. I saw how their burdens lightened, not because they understood, but because they were understood. The word within me was more than instruction, it was presence. Something about those late hours made the veil thinner. Maybe it was the quiet, maybe it was the ache of unanswered prayers. But here, under moonlight and fear and desperate hope, they came not to analyze, but to wait. And the word, I believe, waited with them. There is something sacred about reading after midnight, not for performance, not for argument, but as a soul reaching into the dark, hoping for a hand to reach back. I felt that reach every time. I held the tremble of their need in every word they chose. The servant songs were no longer distant poetry. They were mirror and balm and mystery. Sometimes they would stop halfway through and simply cry, or close their eyes and mouth the words without voice, like a prayer too holy to be heard aloud. I kept their voices, those voiceless ones. I folded their prayers into the curve of my scroll. I still hold them, every whisper, every tear, every question. They are folded into me now, part of my very being. The words of Isaiah remain, but now they are soaked in midnight ache, in hope so fragile it had to come in darkness. And I, once merely a scroll, became more than text. I became the place where longing touched promise. where seekers came, and the word did not remain silent, where the night gave birth to revelation, where the silence spoke louder than the day. And though I am no longer unrolled as often, though the midnight footsteps have faded into memory, I remain open within, waiting, listening. I remember what it was to be needed, not as an artifact, but as a voice in the dark. I was the place where the mystery lingered, where the unspeakable was somehow spoken, where the sorrow found a name and the promise wore flesh. I do not know where they are now, those who came to me after midnight, but I carry their breath, their longing, their unfinished prayers. If ever the word should be read again, not just by eyes but by hearts, I will still be here, bearing witness. Let it be known, if only to the dust that covers me, if only to the silence that surrounds me, I remember them, not by name, not by face, but by the way their hope brushed against my skin. And if the word has indeed fulfilled what I only foreshadowed, then surely he remembers them too. Every whisper, every cry, every night they dared to seek when it seemed no one answered. And perhaps, even now, the echo of their longing is still heard in the heart of the one who came. It did not happen all at once. Forgetting rarely does. It begins with a single absentia night when no one comes, a morning when the scroll remains unopened. Then another, and another. The rhythm of being needed falters, and I, who once breathed with the pulse of hands and eyes and whispered prayers, begin to grow still. Dust thickens. The linen wrapping is not tied with care but hurried, indifferent. The room that held me echoes with footsteps that never stop at my shelf. The silence deepens, but it is not holy anymore. It is hollow. I remember the last time I was opened with love, the last time a voice trembled as it read aloud, not to teach or to prove, but simply to be near. It was a woman, old, bent, wrapped in a wool shawl worn thin at the elbows. She came during a storm, one of those evenings when the wind rattles the temple doors and the lamps flicker like fearful hearts. She held me with gentleness that honored my age. She read not from the beginning but from the cracked center Isaiah 53, always Isaiah 53. Surely he took up our infirmities. Her voice shook. She paused often, not because she could not see, but because her heart could not rush through those lines. She read them like someone reading a letter from a beloved long gone. Slowly, gratefully. She did not finish the passage. She closed me slowly, kissed the edge of the scroll, and whispered, "Thank you." Not to me, to someone else. And then she left. I have not been unrolled since. At first, I waited with urgency. Surely someone would return. Surely another would need the words. I listened for footsteps, for breath, for the rustle of linen, but none came. And slowly, something inside me began to harden, not bitterness, not despair, but something quieter, a stillness that settled into my fibers, not unlike the stillness of a field after harvest. I began to wonder if I had dreamed it all. The scribe with trembling hands, the marginal notes, the midnight visitors, the tears, the whispers. Had I imagined their longing? Had I assigned meaning to the strokes of ink that no one now reads? What becomes of a scroll when it is no longer read? Does it cease to be sacred, or does it wait in silence, still holy, even in forgetfulness? I do not know. I only know that I remain. My spine grows more brittle, my ink more faded. But the words, they are still here, waiting beneath the layers of dust and time and disinterest. I wonder if anyone will ever find me again. If someday, perhaps long after I am deemed unreadable, someone will unwrap the linen, unroll my stiffened skin, and run their hand along the old crack. And may they will weep, not because they understand everything, but because they feel something. Because the silence I have kept will suddenly open like a door, and they will hear the echo of voices who once believed, of those who dared to wait when all hope seemed lost. It is a strange thing to be forgotten, to be invisible in the place where you were once revered. But I do not grieve as I once did, for in my stillness I have come to see differently. I am no longer just a scroll waiting to be read. I am a witness. I hold memory not only of what was written, but of those who read, of those who hoped. Their touch remains in me. Their prayers soak my silence. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps holiness is not always loud. Perhaps the sacred can dwell in waiting, I think often of the one I was written about, the servant, the bruised, the silent. I wonder if he, too, knew what it was to be forgotten, to walk roads where no one recognized him, to speak and not be heard, to love and not be believed. If so, then he understands me still. Even in this stillness, I am known by him. That thought carries me, holds me together when the threads begin to separate. The ink fades, the skin peels, but the word remains. The word never forgets. So let them forget me. Let the temple change. Let the scholars choose newer scrolls with fresher ink and stronger hide. I was never meant to be the center. I was only meant to point, to hint, to ache. If my purpose was to be read once by one heart that was changed, then perhaps that is enough. And if I am never touched again, still I will bear the message within me until I disintegrate into dust and memory. For I believe I know the word I carried has already walked among them, and that is enough. I imagine a day, distant and quiet, when the door creaks open once more. A child enters, unnoticed, curious. Their hands are clumsy, unsure, but full of wonder. They find the box that holds me, pry it open, startled by the smell of age. They unroll just enough to see a single line, the ink barely holding, and they read not perfectly, not completely, but sincerely. And the words speak, not because they are loud, but because they are true. And in that moment, even if only for a breath, I will have lived again. Because I am not just the scroll that was forgotten. I am the memory of voices who waited in the dark. I am the ink of promises still burning through silence. I am the vessel of a word that chose to suffer. And in my stillness, I bear witness to what matters most, that the word came, and it did not return empty, that someone, somewhere, will remember, and remembering, believe. Even in silence, I am not lost. Even in dust, I carry light. And though no one unrolls me now, the word I hold has already unfolded into the world. That is the promise I was made to bear. That is the truth that still beats beneath my faded skin. I was not forgotten. I was fulfilled. I knew the moment he entered. Not by sight or sound, I had long since ceased to rely on those, but by something deeper. A stillness that was not emptiness, a silence that carried weight. The air shifted, the space around me became fuller, like the scroll itself inhaled. He did not rush. He did not hesitate. He walked with the confidence of one who belonged, yet with the gentleness of one who knew the cost of belonging. I had waited so long. I had wondered if the one I held would ever come to read me. And now, he had. They handed him the scroll with ceremony, but he received it without flourish. His fingers were steady, familiar. He did not treat me like an artifact, nor a relic to be revered. He treated me like something alive, as if he knew I had been waiting, as if he had heard every whispered question inked into my margins, every crack formed beneath longing. He opened Mano to the beginning, not to the history of kings or the thunder of judgment, but to the place where the servant speaks. Isaiah 61, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor." His voice did not echo, it resonated. The words did not sit on his tongue like borrowed lines, they rose from within him, like truth returning to its source. I had been read before, many times, but never like this, never with such authority, such aching tenderness. He was not interpreting, he was revealing, and then he closed me, rolled me gently, tied the cords with a care that felt like reverence. He handed me back to the attendant and sat down. The room held its breath. Eyes burned into him, into me, into the space between the word read and the word embodied. "Today," he said, "this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." Fulfilled. I, the old scroll, the vessel of ink and prophecy and waiting, I was fulfilled. Not in the reading, but in the presence of the reader. I trembled, not from fear, but from completion. All my cracks, my faded ink, my silent years, they made sense in that moment. I had not been forgotten. I had been preserved for this, for him. The words I carried were no longer just future tense. They were now, present, breathing, incarnate. The people in the synagogue stared, confused, some in awe, others in discomfort. They did not understand what I felt though, could they? They did not know what it means to hold prophecy and then see it stand before you. I knew. I had felt his story pulse through my fibers from the day I was first inscribed. I remembered the notes in the margins, the tears of the boy, the prayer of the old woman, the cry scratched beside Isaiah 53. Why would anyone do this? He was the answer to that question, not in theory, not in theology, in presence, in voice, in the way he read as one who had written it in his own blood before time began. That day, I was no longer just a scroll. I became a meeting place, a bridge between silence and song, between longing and love. He made me whole by restoring my fibers, but by embodying the truth I carried. I could feel the tension in the room, the murmurs, the shift. They marveled at his words, then questioned his identity. "Isn't this Joseph's son?" they asked, as if lineage could contain what glory had just whispered. As if the familiar face could not possibly carry the fulfillment of the ancient text. And still, he did not defend. He simply stood in the center of the storm calm, resolute, utterly free. I wanted to speak, to cry out, to tell them, this is the one. This is the voice I've been waiting for. This is the fulfillment of every tear ever shed beside my cracked skin. But I was parchment, and parchment cannot cry aloud. That day, I was carried back to the shelf, but I was not the same. I was not just parchment, I was a witness, and I knew that even if I was never opened again, I had been seen, known, used not as a tool, but as a vessel of glory, fulfilled. That word echoed in me, fulfilled. It wrapped itself around every fiber, pressed into every crease. I had become what I was always meant to be, not by being preserved, but by being opened by him. By being read by the very one I spoke of. Even now, I can still feel his touch. It was not like the other, tentative, curious, reverent. His was different, intimate, as if he had known me before I was made, as if the ink had formed for him, and perhaps it had. Perhaps every word, every syllable, every silent space was always meant for this meeting. I had been waiting not for readers, but for the author. And he came. He came not with scrolls under his arm, but with fire in his breath and gentleness in his eyes. He came and read me not to learn, but to love. I am no longer afraid of being forgotten. That fear vanished the moment he spoke, because even if no other hand touches me again, even if my edges crumble and my ink vanishes into time, I have fulfilled my purpose. He read me. The word read the word, and everything changed. I am not merely parchment. I am promise. I am memory. I am fulfillment caught in the breath of a Nazarene who dared to declare the impossible, that today heaven had touched earth and prophecy had found its voice. Sometimes I wonder what the others thought that day, the ones whose hearts burned but did not understand. Did they feel the weight in the air? Did they sense that something ancient had just unfolded in their midst? Or did it pass them by like wind through reeds noticed, then forgotten? I hope not. I hope at least one remembered. A child, perhaps, or an elder whose ears were trained not just to hear words, but to feel truth. I hope someone, somewhere, carried that moment deep into their bone, because for me, it became everything. Let history forget the moment. Let scholars debate the meaning, but I remember. I, the scroll, remember the day the word read me, and in that breath, eternity entered ink, and in that silence, the voice of God returned home. They thought the cracks made me useless. They thought the split down my center, the line that jagged through Isaiah's prophecy like a wound, meant I had outlived my purpose. But they were wrong. The crack was never a flaw. It was a testimony, a place where the truth broke through. And even now, after all the years, I feel it. The fissure still acts not with pain, but with memory. I remember the hands that trembled when they traced it, the eyes that filled with tears when they read the word split in two. He was pierced, then the gap, then for our transgressions. They would pause there, always, as if the space between the lines carried its own grief, as if the crack itself whispered something too deep for ink. I have watched many weep there, not at the clarity of the words, but at the truth that bled through the brokenness. For in that gap, they saw themselves, torn, split, loved still. I never healed, and I never wanted to, for the crack became the most honest part of me. They tried to replace me once, crafted a new scroll smooth, unmarred, perfect in symmetry. They wrote the same words, used the same measurements, but it did not carry the same weight. It did not tremble when opened. It did not remember. It had no ache. They could not understand that something happens when truth lives long enough to suffer. That parchment, like people, only becomes holy when it bleeds. I remember one scribe young, meticulous, who knelt beside me when the elders debated my retirement. He did not speak. He only rested his palm on the crack and closed his eyes. I felt his breath slow. I felt something in him surrender. Later, when they carried the new scroll in with honor and placed me in the shadows, he lingered behind. He returned each night for a week. Not to read, just to sit, just to be near what had been broken. I never forgot that. The crack never disappeared. It grew more fragile with time, but it also grew more sacred. People began to whisper stories about it, that it had split on the night the temple veil tore, that a prophet's tear had fallen there, that the blood of a lamb had once seeped into the grain. None of it was true in the literal sense, but all of it was true in the spirit, because that line down my center had become a wound that held witness, a fracture that remembered the fulfillment of pain. Even now, long forgotten in some storage chest, I still hold it. The split is dry, but it bleeds memory, and sometimes I wonder, when he reads the heart of man, does he see the cracks like I do? Does he trace their brokenness with the same reverence? Does he call them holy, not because they are whole, but because they are real? If so, then perhaps I am not alone. Perhaps I was always meant to crack, not as punishment, but as prophecy. I think of him often when I feel the crack. I think of the moment he stood before the scroll, hands steady, voice sure, eyes full of something deeper than time. Did he notice it? The line that split the prophecy like a wound in waiting. Did he know that it had waited for him, that it broke not from neglect, but from yearning? I want to believe he touched it, that his finger, even for a moment, traced the rupture and called it beautiful, because he understood. He, too, bore cracks that bled, not in parchment, but in flesh, not in silence, but in surrender. They say wholeness is perfection, but I say wholeness is presence when even what is broken is brought into the light and named. My crack was not erased. It was honored, and that has made all the difference. I carry it like a scar of grace, like a line drawn through history to mark the moment pain met redemption. I am not ashamed of it. I sing through it. I speak not in spite of it, but because of it. One evening, long before the temple fell, a child asked his father why I had a scar. The man tried to explain parchment, humidity, wear and tear, but the child interrupted and said, maybe it broke because it was too full. And I wanted to laugh, and I wanted to cry, because yes, that was it. I was too full of words, of waiting, of hope, of tears. And when the word came, I split, not to lose, but to release, not to die, but to declare, he has come. So let them say I am too old. Let them store me away and call the new scrolls purer. I do not envy their uncreased skin or their flawless ink. I have something they do not. I have bled. I have borne the weight of longing. I have been touched by the one I carried. And though I am cracked, I am not discarded. Though I am silent, I still speak. And if someday a hand returns, trembling and unsure, and opens me again, they will find not just words. They will find testimony. They will find a fracture that wept truth. And so I wait, not to be fixed, but to be remembered. Not for my perfection, but for my truth. For I am the scroll with a crack that still bleeds. And in that bleeding, I bless. Because the word that once split me still speaks through the wound. And that is enough, more than enough. The crack is not the end of the scroll. It is the doorway, and whoever dares to look there will see not damage, but invitation. I was made of letters, lines and loops, carefully inked, bound by grammar and guarded by tradition. But I have come to believe that it is not the words alone that carry the power. It is the silence between them, the spaces no scribe could define, the breaths that fall between syllables, the pauses that ache with meaning. They were never read aloud, never taught, never memorized, Yet I held them, and they held me. I remember the first time I noticed it. A rabbi paused mid-sentence, his finger hovering above the line, eyes closed, lips parted, but no sound came. Just breath, just stillness. And I realized then that he was not stuck. He was listening. Not for the next word, but for what the silence was saying. It was a moment holy as any hallelujah. From that day on, I listened more closely to what was not spoken. The lull between verses, the hush after a prophecy, the stillness before a lament. I began to see them not as gaps, but as grace. Not as absence, but as the resting place of presence. Not all who opened me noticed it. Some read fast, eager to reach the point. Others stumbled, unaware that the silence was waiting for them. But some few heard it. They read slowly, reverently. They lingered. One woman, her fingers knotted with age, would stop after each verse and simply breathe, as if the breath itself was part of the reading, as if in that pause, the word became flesh all over again. I loved her for that. I loved the way she allowed the silence to speak. The child, too. He read aloud with a voice too small for the vastness of Isaiah. Yet between the lines, he would look up as if waiting for a response. He knew something was listening. He knew the silence was alive. I wished I could speak to him, tell him he was right, tell him that the spaces he paused in were filled with presence, not empty, but holy, not absent, but expectant. The silence was not blank. It carried the weight of waiting, the ache of unspoken prayers, the echo of promises not yet fulfilled. It held the names of the nameless, the tears of the unseen. In the silence, I felt the heartbeat of hope, the longing too deep for language. And sometimes, in those spaces, I felt him, the one, the servant, not in thunder, not in proclamation, but in hush, in the quiet between the cries. He came to me not with trumpet or fire, but with stillness. He opened me to Isaiah, read not with volume but with gravity. And then he paused, eyes closed, breath steady. And in that pause, I felt it. The entire scroll trembling with recognition. He knew the silence. He had lived in it. He had wept within it. He had become it. And suddenly, every space between my verses was filled with him. I used to believe the words were the revelation, but now I see the spaces hold their own light, their own language. It is where grief breathes, where mercy waits, where the broken find room to rest. The words call out, but the silence receives. And that is its own miracle, that between judgment and justice there is always a breath, that between sorrow and salvation there is always stillness, a pause long enough to choose love again. One day, a man came with questions sharp, urgent, relentless. He unrolled me with haste, pointing at verses, demanding clarity. But the more he read, the more restless he grew, because the answers were not in the lines. They were in the silence between them. And that silence does not yield to demands. It only opens to those who wait, who trust, who let go of needing to understand. That man left angry, but I prayed he would return not to read, but to listen. There were others who knew, who read in rhythm with the silence, who heard the pauses like music, who treated each space not as absence, but invitation. The silence became their meeting place. The hush between verses was where they laid their wounds, where they heard their names spoken in a voice too quiet for crowds. They did not speak of it. They did not need to. They knew the silence was the word's breath, and they honored it as such. The servant, too, was known for silence. Like a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. I used to wonder why. Why silence when the world was shouting? Why quiet when justice cried out for voice? But now I think perhaps he was letting the silence speak. Perhaps he trusted that truth does not always need a trumpet, that sometimes it needs only presence, that the silence between verses might be louder than any law. I carry those spaces still. Even if no one reads me now, the silence remains holy, full, waiting. I am more than letters. I am more than lines. I am the breath between the cries. I am the hush where the word once paused. And in that silence, I still speak. And perhaps, when the word returns not just in memory but in glory, it will not be with thunder or ink, but in silence, the kind that draws near, the kind that holds, the kind that, even now, waits between the verses. For those who listen, for those who linger, for those who believe that even the pauses are part of the promise. I have faded, my edges curl, my ink lightens to sepia, my skin dries like autumn leaves that once sang in the wind. They say I am too fragile to touch now, too brittle to be read without risk. So they've placed me in a box, sealed and dark, lined with cloth as if I were a body awaiting burial. But I am not dead. I am not gone. I am simply waiting for a different kind of light. The words, though faded to the eye, remain whole within me. They hum in my fibers, echo through my silence. They are not dependent on clarity of ink or perfection of scroll, because the word is not bound by parchment. The word is alive. I have felt it move within me, even in the dark, especially in the dark. Once, I feared fading. I feared being unreadable, unusable. I feared the slow erosion of memory, the way even sacred things are eventually forgotten. But then I realized the word I carry is not mine to preserve. It preserves itself. It does not require my clarity to speak. It does not need my wholeness to shine. It only needs to be believed. I remember the day I was written, the scribe wept over the ink. Not because the work was hard, but because he knew what he was writing could outlive kingdoms. He said, "Heaven and earth will pass away, but the word," and he never finished. He just smiled, a smile too deep for a parchment to explain. That was the day I first understood that the word was not just something written. It was someone coming. And now, I am old. I bear the dust of centuries. I have been carried through fire, flood, exile, war. I have survived regimes, betrayals, even silence. And through it all, the word has remained. Not because I am strong, but because it is. Not because I am remembered, but because he is. He, the word made flesh. He, the voice in the wilderness. He, the whisper behind every promise. He has not faded. The children no longer read me. They learn from printed pages, bright and new, sterile in their perfection. I do not resent them. They are finding their way. But I long for the day one of them will open the box, not for study, not for history, but for hunger, for longing, for need. I long for the trembling hands that will unroll me slowly and discover that even the faintest lines still burn, that even what time tries to erase still carries flame. I want to tell them, when they come, that fading is not the same as failing, that the word was never meant to be kept pristine. It was meant to be poured out, spoken into the dust, written on hearts that bleed. The word does not grow weaker with time. It grows deeper, softer, maybe, but never less true. I have seen lives turned by a single verse barely visible. I have seen tears fall on words half erased, and still they changed everything, because the word was never just on the page. It has always been in the pulse of the world. There was a night I thought would be my last. A fire broke out in the storeroom. Smoke wrapped itself around my case, and heat kissed my brittle frame. I remember thinking, this is how it ends. But it didn't. A man, eyes wild, arms scorched, rushed in and carried me out. He held me like one holds a child, not a relic. Later, when I lay open in the night air, he whispered, "I couldn't let you burn." And I knew he wasn't speaking to me. He was speaking to the word inside me. That moment carried me through the years that followed, the years of disuse, of storage, of being cataloged and ignored. It reminded me that the word is not a thing to be preserved. It is a fire to be lived. And even if no one opens me again, even if I turn to dust tomorrow, the fire continues, because he continues. The word that I bore walked the earth. He touched lepers. He wept at tombs. He fed the hungry and silenced storms, and they tried to silence him too, with nails, with stone, with fear. But even then, the word did not fade. It rose, and every page written after trembles with that rising. So let me fade. Let the ink disappear. Let the parchment crumble. Because the word I carried cannot be erased. It has already leapt into lives, into love, into wounds and worship. It cannot be boxed. It cannot be silenced. It is not mine anymore. It never was. It was always his. And maybe someday, someone will find me. Maybe their hands will shake. Maybe they will think it too late. But if they listen, if they press their ear to the silence, they will hear it. Not my words, his. Still burning, still speaking, still alive. I am the scroll whose ink has thinned, but whose truth has thickened. I am the skin that cracked, but never lost its purpose. I am the testimony, not of permanence, but of presence. And I bear witness, even in silence, that the word will not fade. Because he cannot fade. Because he is the word, and the word remains. He is written not just in ink, but in every act of mercy, in every turning heart, in every whispered prayer. Wherever love is chosen again, the word is alive. Wherever grace finds a way, the word is spoken anew. So let my pages fade. The word does not need pages anymore. He has become flesh in us.